And in our business, it's when you run an experiment, you actually don't know whether it's going to succeed or not. Even if you've prepared something for 9 months, you've planned everything, the moment of truth always comes, and whatever that outcome is will quickly determine whether you go one way or the next. So I think for me, I started to see this process as a kind of a co-creation process with God as well in this business, where you have to really seek wisdom one way or the other, to be kind of listening for a higher order wisdom to help guide actions.
Well, hello everyone. I am back for another episode of Up Next, and today I am sitting down for the first time with a new friend, but also a current Resource Global member, recent board member, who I'm just getting to know, Niki Santo over in San Francisco. How are you, Niki?
Hi, Tommy. It's great to be here. Doing well.
Yeah. Now, for you, share with the audience a little bit. What do you do for a living, Niki?
Well, Tommy, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Swaza, which is a biotechnology company based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we create oxygen-based nanotherapeutics. So that includes a breathing aid, the first of its kind that we've developed, which can concentrate oxygen from the air and restore your blood oxygen just by inhaling it.
Yeah, yeah. Now, before we dive into that and how that came about, when you were a little girl, what did you think you were doing, and how did you get to where you are now as the CEO of this organization or this company?
Well, if you would ask the 5-year-old version of me, I always thought I would be an air stewardess because somehow someone told me that that was the most glamorous job you could have. But
Yeah.
for the most part, as a child, I was in love with science. So I had always wanted to go into medicine. But actually, what I'm doing now stems not from direct practice in medicine, even though I do have a molecular biology background from Harvard. But I
Yeah.
had spent the last 20 years in executive leadership in various roles, particularly at the intersection of academia and in business. And coming to this particular venture actually was part of a journey of faith and a shift in identity where I knew I wanted to spend my time building things that mattered. And there was a journey and a process by which that led me to make different kinds of investments, including coming into this company as its first outside investor. But then I quickly transitioned to being part of the management team and now serve as the CEO of the company.
Yeah, very good. And you mentioned a little bit, there was a story of how you got into it because it was really embedded during the COVID season. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. This technology is not specifically limited to COVID, but it was developed as a measure against COVID. Now, my mom was one of the first people to pass from COVID-19 in the state of Virginia. It was still very early in 2020 when we didn't really understand what was going on. And we learned later, because of her story and millions of others, that this idea of mechanical ventilation is actually a very poor solution to a universal problem. That when we get ill, and our blood oxygen starts to drop because our lungs are not working well, the only real course of action that we have is to put people on mechanical ventilators, which feature 40% mortality. They actually damage your lungs, and they don't really solve the underlying problem. Now, our team invented the technology in response to the Delta wave. If you recall, many people in India, for example, were suffering because they couldn't get access to oxygen tanks. So we asked the question, can we solve the problem of oxygen without oxygen tanks? So I have a personal relationship to why I came to this company, but also the pandemic really spurred an identity shift in me where I really understood my role as a steward, not only of money, but of the time, resources, and talents that I have for whatever time that I have them. They are gifts. They're, in a sense, on loan. And I wanted to really align myself with that idea that I'm a steward of those things and then focus on being able to, like I said, create things that matter, but also to work with good people who also believe the same thing. So interestingly, Tommy, even though our company is a deep science company, it's firmly based in material science and drug development, all the top line leadership are also uh, Christ followers in
Mhm.
addition to being scientists.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, Nikki, a lot of times in terms of working with, you mentioned that you were in academia and business and that you're doing startup. Was it a change in thinking you had to go through in terms of a startup? What was the transition like from working probably in more established companies on to now suddenly working on a startup where you have to do all and start all these processes?
Yeah, I was just expressing to some colleagues that being a startup founder really has to have a foundation of humility because you're constantly having to learn and relearn things over again quickly and on the fly. So having a beginner's mind was very important. The good thing is that by that point, I was ready for that in terms of
Yeah,
mentality, but it is a very different journey. I tell people don't do it for your health. I think Tommy, you're also of an entrepreneurial mindset, and the things that you've built in Resource Global. Certainly, it's not glamorous in a sense, but it's always meaningful and important.
yeah, yeah. Even as you reflect, even in the last couple of years, what are some lessons that you've learned, mistakes that you've made, wins that you made, that if you spoke to some of our younger leaders from different parts of the world of what you've learned, what were some of those lessons?
Oh, I've learned a lot of important ones, and I think one of the more profound ones was uh, understanding. My previous understanding was that somehow money is a separate category from people's feelings. Now, it takes a little bit of explanation, but myself, like many others, I suppose, think of money as this thing that sits outside. It's somehow objective. It's somehow, we think of it as a resource that exists outside of ourselves. And we think that um, it, it is kind of numbers on a spreadsheet and that it's connected with this like objective reality. But what I learned in this process is that like any resource, it actually comes back to people. And and when we think about our businesses and the resources that we need, ultimately they always lie within the relationships within people. So even when you're talking about venture capital or when you're talking about, having to do multi-million dollar programs for scientific development, in the end, none of that gets accomplished unless people believe in the story, a shared story that you
Mhm.
all have. And so fundamentally, I think a lot of the mistakes that I made was thinking that there was like this um, rationale that people could come arrive at to be able to decide
Mhm.
whether to support our company or to support what we're doing. And it really comes down to people's motivations and desires in their hearts. And the funny thing about that is that we learn that in the faith as well, that it comes down to the heart. And I'm actually finding that to be the most true, even in the most sort of scientific, hardline, um, big money business. Again, people kind of vote for whatever they do with their hearts. And that was an important lesson to really learn that that's not something separate from our lives. It's very much part of our business
Yeah.
lives as well.
And then, Nikki, with that said, that if someone's listening, then how do you then connect with people with the heart? For you, a lot of times, even as you pitch to different investors, and is it the stories that you're telling? Is it listening to what were their pain points and devising your story and what you guys are doing based upon what you're hearing? How do you connect with their hearts then?
That's right. I thought at first it was about just telling our story really well, but it really starts with an earlier step with listening to what people want and you asking the question, what do you want? Because different people want different things for different reasons. I'll give a concrete example. In the very early days, when we were trying to promote the technology, we really wanted to make sure that people understood it was about saving lives. And we could save millions of people's lives if a technology like this could have been available. For example, earlier in the pandemic, we could have prevented many people from being on ventilators. However, I was actually getting a lot of inquiries from the investment community The investors were interested in how the technology might be able to support their own health and performance in terms of athletic performance
Interesting.
or
Yeah.
longevity, for example. And because I was so committed to this idea of saving lives, I pushed those stories away gently to redirect to say, no, well, this technology is really about saving people who are very sick. And I realize now that that was a mistake, not because our story was wrong, but I wasn't listening to what people were thinking about in their hearts. And they were concerned about living longer, living healthier, living stronger lives. And I could have um, started with them first in that story by being a better listener because the technology did have applications there. And then us walk together to understand the bigger picture of what was possible. So that
Yeah.
was an important lesson I had to learn.
Yeah. And Nikki, a lot of times I'm learning the same thing at Resource Global as well, too. When you sit there and when I talk with different ministry leaders and you're talking with a donor or something like that, you're so laser focused on what you're doing because you think it's the most important thing that you don't listen. And so they're sitting there telling you about their passion for technology and for leadership, but you're focused on children and all you're doing, but you're not listening to the individual. How do you tailor that message? And it's the same thing I find in business development, all of those things. Are you listening to your clients?
Absolutely. And really listening to what they're saying, but also listening to the underlying desire is something that I'm learning to do better and
Yeah.
better these days.
Nikki, another thing in terms of startups, and this is something I've dealt with and I hear from different people, is sometimes you don't know the answers. I mean, it's like when in the Israelites, when Joshua tells them in Joshua chapter 3, pack up everything. We're now going to leave from the wilderness, a home that you've been there for 40 years, and we're going to go to the promised land. They don't know. They've never been there before. As a startup person, what happens when you don't know the answer? And so suddenly you sit with your team, everyone gives you their ideas, and you're sitting there, I've never been this way before. One, how do you make a decision with all the ideas that you have and create that team atmosphere? But then, well, how do you deal with the fact that I don't know what to do?
Well, that's an important thing because with a startup, like with many other things, literally every day that is your everyday experience. You actually don't know what will be the outcome. And in our business, it's when you run an experiment, you actually don't know whether it's going to succeed or not.
Yeah.
So it's a daily occurrence of not knowing the answer, even if you've prepared something for 9 months, you've planned everything. The moment of truth always comes, and whatever that outcome is will quickly determine whether you go one way or the next. So I think for me, I started to see this process as a kind of a co-creation process with God as well in this business, where you have to really seek wisdom one way or the other, to be kind of listening for a higher order wisdom to help guide actions. The other thing, this will sound perhaps strange, but that has transformed how these decisions are made, is actually really focusing on gratitude.
Hmm.
And that's laterally with other people. That's gratitude, of course, to God, but it's also gratitude for the wins, for the positive outcomes. And really, I think once we started focusing on that, it transformed the relationships within the company. It transformed also mindset and how you think about the problems, because oftentimes the unknowns is because we're trying to solve problems. And sometimes the problems can become so big mentally for us that actually it obscures our ability to address them and solve them. And really focusing back on gratitude and thanksgiving as an explicit practice, as part of what I do as a manager, has changed my ability to more clearly see where we should go next. So it's not intuitive, but it is transformative. And the more I talk with other leaders, particularly leaders of faith, I they tell me the same thing, that this idea of Thanksgiving actually changes their ability to be able to see things clearly
Hmm.
and come to that next answer,
Yeah.
because we
Yeah.
don't know what's going to happen. The best that we can arrive at sometimes is what is the next best thing, and the next best thing requires a certain clarity and openness. And I think Thanksgiving and gratitude is one way
Yeah.
to get to that. The other piece that comes from the other side is always having the main vision before you. Usually, when we start something, if you started Resource Global or when we started this company, there was
Mhm.
a glimpse of what it could be, and that glimpse from the future is actually a truth. That's how I consider it. It's a
Mm.
truth that we aim forward to bring it into the present. And so it's always important to keep the vision before you, and to, even if you have written down what the ultimate vision is, to spend time every day or as often as you can coming back to it and putting it before you, because it course corrects any time that you get distracted off of the course, or you're unsure which road to take on that strange map. You kind of point back to that guiding star, because that is in fact a true point. It's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
fixed point. And we in our organizations, we are ultimately making that journey. You mentioned the Israelites. They don't know how, but they know that Canaan is the end point.
Hmm.
Now, they took a circuitous route to get there, but the dream was always one thing, even though the journey was many things.
Yeah. Yeah. I still remember in chapter 3, the key verse that was right there is follow the Ark of the Covenant because you have never been that way before. And they're going to go into the promised land. They're not going to know what's going to be facing them. People who are going to say, oh, here you go. Here, let me turn over my land. They're not going to do that. How then do you trust the process, knowing it's not going to go the way you want it to, but trust and follow the Ark of the Covenant? So, no, this is good. Now, you also mentioned in terms of your style as a manager. What is your style as a manager, as a leader? Is there a certain style that you have, Niki?
I tend to think of myself as a high accountability, low control kind of person and kind of manager. And to be honest, in part because to have high control actually is a lot of work. And I'm too lazy to have to try to micromanage people. So it works out for me. That said, it becomes very important to um, guide people with what the outcome should be and what success looks like. That is my job. But also, high accountability starts with myself first. So if there's a problem or a mistake, ultimately I have to see my contribution in it, even if it's something that I was not directly involved in, because in the end, um, I do take the attitude that ultimately, as a leader, things fall on me, or the responsibility falls to me to take accountability for those things. So that tends to be my general orientation, and I think as a leader and manager, I've continued to evolve myself in this process. Um, I think to lead more with just honesty and um, more vulnerability. Actually, as I get older, I think the idea of that those kind of ego driven ideas that we've had when we were younger, that we need to show competence and strength and that we're in control. Um, um, as time goes by, I realize that those are not necessarily part of who I am now, and I bring more of my whole self to the table. That includes my faith, and it just finds expressions in the things that you value,
Yeah.
and to be able to again understand people more at a heart level. I used to be very separate in my corporate life, and when I was an executive in academia, it was all about sort of an objective function, right? That we were here to achieve goals, and the heart, the person of the heart, was there guiding the values, but it wasn't really a present reality in the workplace. They were two
Mm.
separate domains. In this. this time in this season of life, I'm finding much more of an integration where it actually, I think, is more authentic one, but in a sense more effective to bring that whole person to the table. Because maybe, like you said, it lets you listen better to
Yeah.
other people and let them bring their whole person to the table. And ultimately, that what that results in is better understanding both ways.
Yeah.
And when you can arrive at a better understanding, you can get better results, whether that's in an interpersonal relationship or in business.
And what you said is very important. Nikki, if someone was listening to you, they would probably say, Nikki, when did you realize that? Was it something that happened that made you to merge the two together? Did someone give you feedback on your leadership? How did you realize that? Or it's just a matter of just continuing to grow and experience as a leader?
There is an aspect of continuing to grow and experience, but I think the nature of a startup company itself really forces you to address that question of style and what's effective. In a larger organization or in a more formal environment, you have the benefit of formal authority to and establish roles and functions to be able to guide the activity of whatever the group is doing. Actually, in a startup, because a lot of things are unformed, you're actually a team that is there by choice to be able to achieve a common purpose. And so therefore, you're constantly negotiating that commitment day in and day out. It's not a given that you'll have a co-founder or a team member want to stay with what you're doing. People have to be there because they choose to be there. And because of that, actually, as a leader, you constantly have to negotiate that relationship with each individual involved. And then because it's really about the discretionary effort, unlike in a bigger organization where people are often there because it's a job, right? And it's a function. In a startup organization that's really mission driven, whether that mission is ministry or technology or whatever it is, this is about discretionary effort is much more important than the salary people are getting. And because they don't know whether your company is going to be successful or not, they have to believe that it will be. And I think that has forced this change in me because in a situation where we all have to agree to want to do this, and to make people want to do something and care about it for their own reasons is a completely different management task than to organize people's efforts towards a common organizational goal.
Yeah, 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 yeah. If I was to ask you as the CEO and you continue to inspire that vision, what is the vision of Swaza? What are you hoping that it will change and address if this thing becomes successful?
So Swaza's whole inspiration is to build drugs and biomaterials that enhance and add to human life. We believe that we can use science to be life affirming. So we build materials and products that are regenerative in nature. And it's a very joyful mission because we believe that it actually ties in to who we are as believers. This idea of having life in that more abundantly, and we get to participate in that. So ultimately, that's the underlying vision. So we exist to build drugs and materials that enhance and extend human life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Another thing that I want to ask you that you talked about was this whole idea of high accountability. And in a Christian world or experience that we roam in or in our churches and all that stuff, that's not always encouraged. And the reason I say that is literally, I was just talking with a coworker or a teammate that was in another part of the world. And she says, well, I thought things were going to be different. that when I came over to Resource Global, that it was going to be a more ministry setting. And I had to sit there and share with her, hey, look, as much as there is a ministry setting where we're all Christ followers, we all encourage each other, all of that stuff, there is still high accountability. There is still high goals. There is still a high expectation. Talk to me about a lot of times as a Christ follower and accountability. Do you notice a lot? How do you still have grace but still hold people accountable?
Right. I kind of chuckle a little bit when you say that sometimes we categorize ministry as being somehow lower accountability than business. That's absolutely not the case. If you really
Yeah,
think about it, it should be the
yeah.
highest form of
We
accountability
should be the
because
highest. We lead with
we're
excellence.
yeah, we're dealing with people's spirits and their deepest selves. And so when to your question of how do we hold people accountable with grace, I think again, uh, funnily enough, gratitude is part of that. It helps you be very honest with what people are doing well, but then also sets the right mindset to which to have a conversation about areas where and having an honest conversation about what needs to be different when there are things that need to be different. It's it's not there's not a one shot rubric for it, but I think when you have that, grace and truth are always intertwined. They're never really separate. And you really truly actually cannot have grace if there isn't also truth. That's what I'm starting to learn more for myself, that not being 100% honest when something is disappointing, not being 100% honest when there is a goal and we are falling short, collectively as a team, or there was something not met that was really critical. Being honest about that is very important. Now, where the grace comes in is how. Um, I know myself, I'm a passionate person, and I think a former version of myself would be much more reactive in terms of very quick to try to fix, address, and um, kind of force the conversation. I find myself now being able to step back and understand that grace is understanding first the truth and being able to speak that truth in a way that doesn't doesn't judge. It's very different. Accountability and judgment are two different things. Judgment is about the person's character, right? You failed because of some inherent flaw or inability in you, versus accountability, which is to say, this is something that you or we were responsible for, and it fell short in these
Yeah,
ways.
yeah, yeah,
And inviting a conversation of how each person, including yourself as the leader, contributed to that outcome. It's a very different conversation when you're trying to pull judgment out of that. You did this because you were lazy, or it didn't get done because you didn't care enough about it. Now, those things actually may be true, but when you're focusing on a grace centered accountability discussion, you really pull back judgment of the person and to see with eyes of love. Actually, it's like you would talk to somebody you love, that you have a deep relationship with. You speak to that person differently because the relationship matters. And even if that means that it's not the right person for the organization, or the organization is not the right organization for him or her, that conversation can still be had with grace and truth, because you're not ultimately kind of serving as the final judge, right?
yeah,
We
yeah,
don't have to take on that role, but what we do take on is the stewardship function,
yeah,
And so our stewardship responsibility requires us to steward whatever we've been entrusted with. And I think people, when you're being genuine about that, they can see that. And those conversations are never easy, but they become cleaner and clearer.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And Nikki, I think a lot of times for all of our team, whether it's at Resource Global or the organizations I lead, in even ministry setting, I love what you're saying is, hey, look, you have the freedom to do what you need to do. All right. I'm not going to micromanage you, but there are still expectations and still deliverables timelines you have to meet. And like you said, the excellence in which we lead and do our job will always be there because Christ has put you in this situation. You lead and you do the best, not just do the best job that you can, but you lead with deliverables and get things done. But yet at the same time, I'm going to have grace. We're going to talk. I'm going to treat you like an individual who I highly respect. I'm going to honor you, and we're going to have those frank conversations. I'm going to serve you, and we're going to talk about how we're going to promote you, but there are also deliverables that you have to make. So, no, thank you very much. Yeah. Nikki, at last, as we begin to wrap up here, for all of these young marketplace leaders who are listening in, or different people who are listening in, ministry leaders, what's a word of advice? What's a word of caution or advice that you would give to these guys?
Especially for the young leaders, whether they're in ministry or they're running a company, I would actually encourage them to start a practice by which they pray for their key reports or their
Mm,
reports directly, um, because that helps you meditate on really uh, what they need. And kind of to your last point about accountability and the results that need to be achieved. If, for example, I wish there was more of a spirit of excellence in this team.
mhm.
We'll start praying for a spirit of excellence for specific people or members of that team. I think I, it transforms things, not only because it transforms you as a leader, how you think about people, but actually it just also invites God into your business in a really new way. And every time that I've been consistent or focused on that kind of practice, it really has had amazing
Yeah,
results. Far beyond your capability as an individual leader, we are always partnering with a bigger leader in what we're doing. Because again, it's steward consciousness. We don't own anything. We are part of something bigger. And
yeah,
so we can always reach into that bigger picture. And I would recommend every young leader, no matter where you are, to start doing that. And then I would actually be interested in hearing the results of what happens when they do that.
yeah. We're talking with Niki Santo, CEO of Swaza, and also one of our newest Resource Global board members. Nikki, if people want to follow you, hear more about what you're doing, LinkedIn, social media, which ones are you usually on?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn at Niki V Santo. Our website is www.swaza.life, and you can actually find and connect with me there. So I look forward, and any of the leaders or Resource Global members around the world want to connect. I'd love to hear more about what they are all doing, and am excited for their journeys and the work that they will be doing.
Got it. Nikki, thank you so much for finding some time and for jumping on today. I appreciate it.
It's been fun. Thanks, Tommy.
Talk soon, Nikki.
Take care.